Jason Vita here with the Richmond Spiders with Joe Lunardi, ESPN bracketologist. Joe, thanks for joining us. First question, I know how many hours go into putting together this bracket. What was it like to do all that work and then never get the answers to the test?
That's a great way to put it, because when asked, I've said, if you study for an exam, generally you want to take the exam, right? And see how you did. But this was such an odd situation. And, by the time that Thursday came around, right, it was a Thursday, we were still cranking, we were still doing it, we were still pushing content up until, 1 or 2 that afternoon. I was still feeding production trucks at the ACC tournament and the SEC tournament, with all the typical bracketology scenarios for the teams in those leagues. And it was just clear to me that we were headed down the path toward at least a postponement, if not an outright cancellation. So at that point, in the moment, I was maybe a little bit relieved because of the uncertainty that surrounded all of our jobs and lives at that point. I had been in Brooklyn for a day and a half or so for the early rounds with St. Joe's, and then back up at ESPN in Connecticut. And, probably like a lot of people at that point, I just wanted to come home and see my family. And then Friday, Saturday, sitting around the house in what would normally be the busiest days of the year, you start thinking to yourself, what am I supposed to do? And now what? 2-3 weeks later, we're still asking ourselves, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, it sounds like it might be for a couple more weeks. So before all this, though, obviously you mentioned it was, right in the midst of the busiest days of the year, kind of right before, I think might have even been the night before Richmond had been in, Richmond had been out. You kind of moved them into the field, which is your projections as to what the selection committee might have done. So I guess kind of what tipped the scales in their favor? Why do you think the selection committee would have had them in the field?
I'm trying to remember the exact sequence of events. I know that when I left Brooklyn, so that was Wednesday afternoon, I saw some people, and I was actually texting with your guy, David Walsh, and I said, I have you at 69, first out, and there's some games tonight that could go in a way that will move you in.
I can tell you, it was Stanford.
Okay.
And Xavier DePaul, I think, were the two ones that kind of did it.
Okay. And that moved Richmond and maybe Texas in. Mm-hmm. And for, again, we all got time stopped. On Thursday afternoon, Texas was going to play Texas Tech. Mm-hmm. And if they win, maybe they bump Richmond or somebody else. And there were other games involving bubble teams that were taking place on and around that time. Indiana was going to play. They had gotten by Nebraska in kind of the early round of the Big Ten tournament. My opinion was that Richmond should be, I don't want to say solidly, but comfortably enough in so that those games didn't matter to them. I thought their body of work was clearly acceptable. But again, it's not my vote, as you said at the outset. It's what I think the committee would do in a given moment in time.
You've done this simulation. It's been great to follow on Twitter at ESPN Lunardi. You did have the Spiders advancing kind of through the first 4 and up to, speaking of the A10, the Sweet 16, where they faced Dayton and went down by just a couple. And you kind of also mentioned that you would have maybe foreseen a Dayton-Richmond A10 championship game. When you look at those two squads, kind of the top 2 seeds in the A10, how do you think those, what would have determined the outcome of those matchups kind of on the court, you think?
Well, in fairness, and, at the risk of never being welcome again at the Robins Center, if Dayton and Richmond played a best of 7 on a neutral court, Dayton would win. and they'd win in 5, probably maybe 6 if everything went Richmond's way. And that's not a knock on Richmond. Like, Dayton was one of the 3 or 4 greatest Atlantic 10 teams ever this season. I've been around the A10 since 1983, and there have been 4 teams, that were Final Four level, kind of by decade. Temple in '88 was number 1 in the country, lost in the Elite Eight. UMass in '96 was kind of the culmination of that era, and they made the Final Four at the Meadowlands. St. Joe's in '04, a lot of similarities to this Dayton run. National Player of the Year, National Coach of the Year, undefeated regular season. Dayton didn't lose a 40-minute game this year. Their 2 losses were in overtime. National Player of the Year, Jameer Nelson, Obi Toppin, and then, of course, this Dayton team. So, Dayton was that good. And in going back and looking at the bracket, it's hard to slot the first 4 teams, the ones that go to Dayton. So, in a perfect world, had Richmond and Dayton both advanced to the Sweet 16, they really shouldn't have been paired with one another. But it is permissible to meet in that round because they played twice and not 3 times leading up to that point. Had they played 3 times, the committee by rule would have had to keep them separated until the round of 8. Sure. And those rules can be relaxed a bit when you're trying to slot the first 4 because there's only so many gaps in the bracket where those teams can go. And if you're putting in a team like Texas, who Richmond beat in the Twitter tournament in the first 4, there's a lot of other Big 12 teams where, okay, if Texas wins that game, what region do they go? And who might be lurking in a round where they couldn't meet, right? Especially in a Big 12 where they do play a double round robin. So any conference tournament game in that league is automatically the 3rd meeting.
Interesting. So
that then really limits where Texas could go, and that was probably as good a reason as any to eliminate them against the Spiders, because then I didn't have to deal with who they had to play. So there you have it.
Regardless of the kind of the matchup and the opponents, but just, based on your own kind of analysis and what you saw, you did have the Spiders as like a Sweet 16 caliber team. So, from having seen them up close and what you saw on TV, why do you think Richmond was a Sweet 16 caliber team this season?
Well, I just think they were playing their best basketball at the end of the year. And I like teams that can score from a lot of positions. I think they're hard to prepare for. I think that they have, ways to get baskets in tight spots. And let's face it, more often than not, these tournament games are, 65-65 with 4 minutes to go, right? So, give me 3 or 4 guys on the court who can all go make a play. I don't think, Coach Mooney would take me off his Christmas card list if I said, I don't think the Spiders were the most locked down defensive team in the history of the college game. But, most other teams aren't either. And I just really liked their style of play for the kinds of games that we see in the tournament. And certainly there's every, indication to be optimistic about next year from a basketball standpoint anyway. And, let's hope all goes as we wish. Should everything resolve itself in terms of, the pandemic, and obviously things are still developing with that. Things are still developing with A10 rosters even this week, but kind of looking ahead to next season, are there 2 or 3 teams that you think are going to be NCAA tournament, caliber teams coming out of the A10? I think Dayton, even without Obi Toppin, is an NCAA tournament caliber team, it's hard in the A10 to automatically say you're going to make it, right? Because we all know the disadvantages of not being in one of the power football conferences. You don't get as many opportunities for the kind of resume building wins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're Indiana, you can have a half dozen slip ups. Mm-hmm. If you're Dayton without Obi Toppin, you can maybe have one slip up or two slip up. But as long as Crutcher comes back and they have their perimeter, I think they'll be in the mix. If I were voting today in a preseason ballot, I'd probably be picking between Richmond and St. Louis. And I haven't done the deep dive on the kind of little algorithm, if you will. In a week, the day or two after what would have been the NCAA championship game on that Monday night coming up next week, we will post next year's bracket. Yes, this is insane. I would say it's a little less insane when one has all this week to do the number crunch, because it's either that or go out and rake the yard or walk the dog. I'll take Burger B and do the bracket, and that will be we measure returning minutes, the offensive and defensive efficiency of those minutes, the established level of play of those minutes as determined by net and Ken Palm and other metrics from the prior season. And then we make an educated guess at the level of play those minutes will be replaced by. Mm-hmm. So there's a bias in the formula toward teams that return a lot, wink, wink. And, that should go a long way in certainly putting Richmond in the projected field.
All right, so next year's bracket coming next week from Joe Lunardi, not a day too soon.
That's right. And it should have multiple Atlantic 10 teams and probably still not enough to avoid the call from Drew.